As people know on the podcast, I have Lee, and I love Lee. And so what we're going to do today is, this is a press I got. Basically what we're going to do is show you kind of what you would do, say you got this press at a garage sale, and currently it's set up for 45 cal, and we're going to switch it over to 40 Smith & Wesson, which is what I primarily load for pistol. And so we're going to show you what the process would be for that.
The first step in converting over to 40 would be to release the powder measure from the press. We're just going to take the chain out of the return lever as well. Okay, and then we want to just remove the tubes for ease of removal of the bullet feed and case feeder. Okay. And then we'll just want to loosen up the bullet seating die to release the bullet feed kit. Next up, we're going to loosen the screw that attaches the attach plate to the carrier. And we'll set that aside. The next step is to remove the turret. So we're going to loosen the turret lock and pull out the turret. Next step is to remove the case feeder. So we're going to loosen the bolt, unscrew the nut, we're going to lift the cylinder and plate out and pull the slider out, as well as disengage the feed rod. Next step is to loosen the knurled nut on the top of the shell plate. And then we're going to need to loosen the case retainers. We're going to remove the shell plate.
Take the rod off.
Okay. And now we have easy access to remove the primer feed. So we're going to be switching to small primers for the 40. And now's a good time to inspect the portion of the carrier that the pin rides in. So we're going to take out the large pin and spring and make sure that spring is in good condition so that we have reliable feeding once we switch over to the 40. Next, we're going to install the small primer pin and spring. So what we want to do is depress the primer rocker, excuse me. Insert the pin and spring, and now we're set.
Inserting the small primer trough assembly into the Loadmaster carrier. One important step to make sure is that when inserting the small primer trough assembly, the small spring that resets the primer feed, be careful not to crush it. Drop assembly straight in, noting there should be no resistance met, just simply fall straight in. Once you reinstall the small primer trough assembly, take a number 2 Phillips screwdriver, swing out the case retainer, and lightly snug. At this point, you'll be ready to drop in your shell plate. The next step is to set your case retainers. To do that, push all the case retainers in so they lightly contact the shell plate and snug with a number 2 Phillips. You want to take a sample piece of brass, which in this case happens to be a 40 Smith & Wesson. Install your indexer. Next, you will need to put on the case ejector, the lock nut with O-ring facing the case ejector, lightly snug. Raise the press to the top of the stroke. Make sure it positively indexes. In this case it does. Insert your brass into the shell plate and rotate to all 5 positions. Your case retainers will be properly set. The next step on setting up your Loadmaster for 40 Smith & Wesson is to set the primer seating depth. The primer seating depth is a relatively simple adjustment. To do it, you will need a 7/16 wrench and a case with a spent primer. What you want to do is insert a case with a spent primer into station 1 and index press to station 2 and raise to the top of the stroke. You want to loosen the jam nut on the primer seating bolt and run all the way to the top. Verify it's at the top, all the way threaded in. Lower the handle, which raises the press arm to the top of the stroke. And you want to take your thumb, depress the primer rocker lever, and turn down the bolt until it makes firm contact with the lever. Upon making firm contact, lower the shell plate and turn 2 full wrench flats. Raise the shell plate back to the top of the stroke, which holds it in position, and then you can set the jam nut with a 7/16 wrench. At this point, your primer seating depth is properly adjusted. Any fine adjustments can be made, as we initially did, to get your primers flush to slightly below flush. They'll be right where you want to be. Lock. Setting your dies in a Loadmaster set up in 40 Smith & Wesson. Raise your ram to the top of the stroke. Ensure that's the top of the stroke by holding the lever down. Screw in the universal decapping die until it contacts the shell plate. And set the lock ring. Next step is to install the carbide full-length resizing die with the decapper removed. To remove the decapper, you would need a 3/4 inch wrench and a 1/2 inch wrench, and it's righty-tighty, lefty-loosey. When setting the carbide full-length resizing die, raise the shell plate to the top of the stroke. Screw in the carbide full-length resizing die until firm contact is made with the shell plate, and go an additional 1/4 turn to ensure that firm contact with the shell plate is met. Set the lock ring.
Screw the die in until it touches the shell plate.
In this step, we're adjusting the powder through expanding die.
Then back it out 1 full turn. Finger tighten the lock ring. The next step is installing the bullet seating die. Your die set includes the bullet seating feed die for use with the automatic bullet feeder. It has a 45-degree chamfer to allow for the mechanical feed fingers and improved operator clearance. Raise the ram to the top of the stroke and hold. Screw the bullet seating die in until it touches the shell plate. Then back it out 3 full turns. Lightly finger tighten the lock ring. Bullet's depth is adjusted by screwing the adjusting screw in or out to suit. Bullets should be seated deep enough to work through the gun's action.
Installing the carbide factory crimp die for 40 S&W 10mm in the Loadmaster press. Thread the die into the turret until it touches the shell plate with firm contact. Set the lock ring, finger tight. Insert a load round into the die, and you can adjust your crimp by simply screwing in the knob on top. Crimper sleeve makes contact with the round inside the die. You can screw in a 1/2 turn for a light crimp or 1 full turn for a heavy crimp. And that's how you adjust the carbide factory crimp die. Mounting the bullet feed kit to the Lee Loadmaster. You want to attach the attach plate to the carrier with the provided fastener. Number 2 Phillips to tighten it down. Remove the bullet seating and crimp die. Raise the ram to the 1/2 stroke position. There's an offset bend on the end of the action rod that goes into the rearmost hole on the bullet feed kit. it needs to slide into this crank arm as shown, with the bend facing the outside. Simply lace it into the hole. At this point, you can reinstall your bullet seating die that was adjusted in the previous steps and lightly snug the lock ring. Cycle press to validate the operation. Your bullet feeder is now properly installed. Installing the Lee Pro Auto Disc powder measure into the powder through expanding die on a Lee Loadmaster. Verify that there is a powder through expanding plug in your powder through expanding die. It's a floating plug. Next, orient the drop tube with the powder through expanding die and tighten down the swivel adapter until it makes firm contact with the bottom side of the die. Your powder measure is now installed. You can cycle the lever by hand to verify function. The next step is to hook up the safety return chain. This chain resets the powder measure after it is case activated and is necessary in a progressive application. You want to take the bead chain with the bell on the bottom, the buffer spring, and you want roughly 5 beads of chain hanging out the bottom. Pass it through the bullet feed attach plate. Next, you want to lace it through the outermost hole on the powder measure as such and pull it taut. This next step is very important. You want to slightly raise the ram and pass 1 extra bead through the return lever. This will apply tension to the bead chain and it will have some tension. You should be able to flick it and it should be taut. Take this remaining bead chain and pass it through the innermost hole of the return lever and pull tight. Your safety chain is now set.
Installing the case feeder. Cases are slid close to the shell plate on the downstroke of the ram and pushed into the shell plate as the ram starts upward. This unique action is achieved with a crank connected to an angled slide with the crank slider. The feed bracket can be easily adjusted in or out as required to fully insert the case. Once set, usually no further adjustment is needed unless you change from a very large case to an extremely small case. Next step is to lubricate the undersized tongue of the carrier with 30 weight motor oil or equivalent.
An important step also when you lubricate it is to take your slider and run it back and forth a half a dozen times to distribute the oil properly.
The next steps are best performed without primers and the turret not installed. Insert the round end of the quarter square shaft into the feed bracket, making sure that it is turned with a flat side square to the press. The crank wire should enter the end hole of the case slider. Tighten the set screw.
You need a 7/16 wrench to tighten it up. Then you want about a number 2 pencil's distance between the crank slider assembly and the tongue of the carrier. And you just want to hand tighten it. You don't need to put a 10-foot bar on it to tighten it. Once you have that set, you should be able to cycle the press and watch operation of the case feeder.
Attach the cylinder and plate as shown. This assembly should be slightly more than 1 case length above the carrier tongue. A close adjustment of the height will keep cases from tipping. However, it should not be so close that the slight case length variances will cause binding.
You want roughly a quarter's thickness between the top of the case mouth and the bottom of the feed cylinder. That'll provide the necessary clearance for it to smoothly operate. Once you have your height set, take your 7/16 wrench and snug up that jam nut to hold it in position. Testing the function of your now set up Loadmaster in 40 Smith & Wesson. Take a once fired case, drop it in, ensure that the case feeder properly places on the tongue of the carrier and shoves it into the shell plate. On the first station, you're going to decap the spent primer. On the second station, the primer sensor on the primer feeder is triggered. That's going to feed a primer. You're You're going to race to the top of the stroke. It's going to fully resize the case and seat the primer. Station 3 is your powder through expanding die. It's going to flare the case mouth and drop the appropriate powder charge at the same time. Station 4 is your bullet seat and crimp die. In this case we have the bullet feeder removed for ease of taking a video. This station we have set up just to seat the bullet, as we have the crimping operation performed in Station 5. Station 5 is your carbide factory crimp die. This station is going to post size the case, which will remove any bulges or imperfections from seating a bullet. And it's also going to apply a factory style crimp and ensure that the case will chamber in any standard firearm.